We will commence our meeting tonight. This is the 797th regular meeting of the Civil War Roundtable. And I see that Marshall's in on this. I don't know the exact date the organization was founded, our roundtable, but I do know that this is the 80th anniversary, December 1940, I believe, was the inauguration of our organization. And sadly, we would have had our 800th meeting tonight, but for the 3 meetings that had to be canceled this earlier this year, which is it would have been nice to have the 800th meeting along with the 80th anniversary tonight. But we will get there in 3 months. It would have been good to have Dave talk on the 800th, but he's here with us on the 80th. So with that in mind, I'm sorry, somebody said something.
It was December of 41.
Oh, it was 41. So we're not there. We're on 79. It's interesting because this is would have been our 800th meeting, but being corrected.
1940.
Move on. I'm sorry, somebody said 40?
Yeah, 1940, December 3rd.
41.
That's what Scott McElvain says. Well, since I said this was the 80th anniversary, I better stick with that. But there's always controversies over the Civil War, as well as the Round Table. But needless to say, we've been here a long time. We're on 797, and we have Dave Powell joining us tonight to talk about his book, Union Command Failure in the Shenandoah Valley, which seems to be a little bit of a deviation from his usual work on the Chattanooga, Tullahoma campaigns, of which I think I've counted about, at least 8 books. I may be off by a bit. A couple for the emerging Civil War, as well as the 3 volumes on the Chickamauga campaign, co-author of the Tullahoma campaign book, and Failure in the Saddle, as well as this new volume on Grant. So we know Dave very well, but we don't know as much about the subject he's going to talk about tonight, because as I understand it, we generally get lots of information on the VMI cadets at the Battle of New Market, and Dave, I think, is going to give us a bigger, more broad approach to the campaign in the Valley in the early part of 1864. So with that, I give you Dave Powell.
All right, we need to do one thing here. I want to share my PowerPoint. I think I can do that now. There we go. Union strategy in 1864, specifically in the Shenandoah Valley. First of all, thank you all for having me. I've been honored to speak before the Chicago Roundtable a couple of times, and I always enjoy meeting everyone. Unfortunately, now we have to meet virtually, but that's the way things are these days. I'm a graduate of the Virginia Military Institute. I graduated in 1983. And over the years I spent there, I also managed to do things at Living Histories at the Newmarket Battlefield, which is state-owned and managed and basically operated as a part of VMI. And so, as Mark pointed out, most of my writing, most of my focus has kind of been on the Western theater, and specifically on the Chattanooga corridor, the approach to Chattanooga and Atlanta. But I've always had a soft spot for Newmarket. I spent a lot of time there. I got, I camped on the field, slept in the house, the Bushong house that still stands. And I was always drawn to it. I always wanted to write something about Newmarket. Unfortunately, there are, unfortunately for me, not for you, there are already a couple of pretty good books on the battle. But as Mark pointed out, they they tend to focus on the Confederate side of the story. The Newmarket cadets actually fought at Newmarket, the VMI cadets rather. They were called out as part of the Virginia militia, and so they have an actual battle streamer on the regimental flag at VMI. They took about 250 cadets into action and suffered 47 killed, wounded, and missing. They have tended to dominate the story of Newmarket very, very powerfully. I mean, it's a dramatic moment. And the two significant modern books, Jack Davis's book on the Battle of Newmarket, and then in 2010, the book called Valley Thunder came out. Charles Knight wrote that, and both are excellent books. They give you the story, but they have a couple of spots where I found myself wanting more, and that's what led me to write Union Command Failure in 1864. The Union side of the story is largely ignored or painted in broad brush terms. The focus is on the Confederate side and especially the VMI cadets. So Franz Sigel, who's the Union commander at the Battle of Newmarket, is largely reduced to caricature. He's simply dismissed as incompetent, and we plenty of his commanders at the time, Grant and Halleck included, thought he was incompetent. So it was no surprise to anyone that Newmarket turned out to be a Confederate victory, and Franz Sigel has largely been swept under the rug. But I wanted to look a little closer and do a little more in-depth research, and I wanted to kind of look at the Union side of the hill. In the concept of battle studies or staff rides, as opposed to just a standard tour, the purpose of the staff ride is to sort of examine the decisions that are made, put yourself in the heads of the commanders as much as possible, and talk about whether those decisions were good or bad and why they were made. And I found there was very little of that concerning Franz Sigel and his subordinates, or even in terms of Grant's strategy for the Shenandoah for General Grant. So that was my departure point for this book. And I want to talk about the painting you see before you is Ulysses S. Grant on Orchard Knob, November 25, 1863 at Chattanooga. Since my strength is at Chattanooga, I thought I'd be safe in starting from that point. I've contended that Chattanooga really made Ulysses S. Grant. Yes, he was the conqueror of Vicksburg. Vicksburg surrendered to him on July 4th, 1863. He captured nearly 30,000 Confederate soldiers. It was an enormous triumph. But then you look at what happened in August and September, July, August, September 1863, Union Army didn't seem to know what to do with Grant. The Union High Command didn't. They left him to sit there in Mississippi. They talked about breaking up his army and sending it to other commanders. It's not the usual strategy for a victorious commander coming off a significant triumph. Then the crisis, the defeat at Chickamauga happens. The Union Army under Rosecrans retreats into Chattanooga. And suddenly there's a crisis. The federal government rushes troops from all over the country to try and reinforce Chattanooga. And Lincoln and Edwin Stanton pick Ulysses S. Grant to command that effort. Grant, certainly won't talk about that in detail, but Grant arrives in Chattanooga on October 23, 1863. And by November 27th, the Confederate Army has been driven off Missionary Ridge, has been defeated badly, suffered thousands of prisoners. It's a tremendous victory for federal arms, and the whole nation celebrates it. It's similar, certainly in terms of popularity at the time, to the twin successes at Gettysburg and Vicksburg. It's an enormous a victory of enormous import. And that really is what solidifies Grant's position, allows the federal government or encourages the federal government, to Abraham Lincoln especially, to pick Grant as their overall commander for the war effort. He comes east for the first time in March of 1863. He meets, March of 1864. He meets with Abraham Lincoln. He's promoted to lieutenant general, the first ever general of that grade. So much so important that we have to go back. Congress goes back and posthumously promotes General George Washington to lieutenant general. Just as an aside, every time we create a new rank in the U.S. military, we go back and promote General Washington. So if we ever have a 6-star rank, General Washington, we do have a 6-star rank because General Washington was promoted to 6-star above all 5 stars. I always find that an interesting bit of history. No matter what happens, we're going to go back and promote General Washington. Grant comes east. He's picked to conduct the overall war effort for the Union armies. He's the third man to hold this job. The first is George B. McClellan. McClellan held that position from 1861 until early 1862, when Grant was dissatisfied with McClellan's point of view and how the war was going to be conducted, and first reduced him to just commanding the Eastern Army, and then finally replaced him. The second man was Henry Halleck, who came in July of 1862, and actually holds the position that Grant is appointed to up and to the point where Grant is promoted. But Halleck is also of no help. Abraham Lincoln, Edwin Stanton, and in fact, most of the cabinet end up becoming pretty disgusted with Halleck because he won't issue any orders. He doesn't want to override the men in the field, and so he defers to them. And ultimately, the Union war effort does not have the guiding hand that Abraham Lincoln is so desperately looking for. So Halleck is a failure. It's not until Grant that Lincoln thinks at last he's got the man he needs. Grant had an interesting approach to the conduct of the war in 1864. First of all, I'm sure everybody knows, or almost everybody has heard, that Grant wanted a unified military approach. He wanted all the Union armies operating together to apply continuous pressure on the Confederacy. And he wanted that pressure to be continuous. When the army started to move, they would keep moving. They wouldn't turn back. They wouldn't go into, they wouldn't fight a battle and then go into a rest period. It was to be constant pressure through the summer of 1864. But perhaps lesser known is that Grant's military operations involved a major effort from Chattanooga down to Atlanta, a second major effort across the Gulf Coast from New Orleans to Mobile, and then a thrust up from Mobile towards Atlanta. So it's sort of a two-pronged approach on Atlanta. And then another Union army to move either from Southeast Virginia or along the Carolinas to land at the coast and move inland. Grant wanted George Gordon Meade in the Army of the Potomac to do to basically strip down to 40,000 men and leave them in Northern Virginia to make sure that Lee didn't capture the capital. But there would have been no overland campaign, no wilderness, no Spotsylvania, etc. The federal government wasn't keen on that, especially Lincoln and Stanton. They wanted a campaign in Virginia. They wanted the main Union Army, the Army of the Potomac, to be between them and Lee. They didn't like the idea of Robert E. Lee running around in Virginia and Pennsylvania essentially unopposed. Grant expected Lee to be drawn into the Carolinas, but Lincoln and Stanton had seen that before, and it hadn't worked out the way federal commanders planned. So in the end, we get two main efforts. We get Grant towards Richmond, Sherman towards Atlanta. Grant still wanted that Mobile operation with Nathaniel Banks, but the government had different plans there too. Banks was needed in Louisiana. In fact, Lincoln wanted Banks to move up the Red River all the way into East Texas for various political and Reconstruction reasons. In order to support his moves in Virginia, Grant turned to two subsidiary departments. He still wanted a coastal operation. This time it would be under Benjamin Butler, and that would move up the coast, up the peninsula, basically, or on the south side to move against Petersburg and take Richmond from the south. And then he wanted a Union operation in the Shenandoah Valley. Franz Sigel would command the northern part of that. George Crook would command the southern part of that. And altogether, these operations would eliminate Lee's supply lines and especially eliminate the Shenandoah as a supply point of view. Grant also, he was unhappy with Banks and Butler. They were civilian politicians, not professional soldiers. So Grant came up with the idea of stiffening their resolve or strengthening their ranks. Their second in commands were men appointed by Grant who were West Pointers. William B. Franklin was a classmate of Grant's, graduated first in the class of 1843. He would be second in command to Banks, and Benjamin F. Butler would be corseted, I guess might be the term, by William F. Baldy Smith, who was a graduate, West Point, 1845. Grant didn't know Smith as well in the pre-war Army, but Baldy Smith had really impressed him in the operations around Chattanooga. He was the chief engineer of the Army of the Cumberland during that time. He was also a compatriot of William Franklin's in the Army of the Potomac. And so Grant figured that by employing these two professionals subsidiary to the two Army commanders, the two politicians, he could avoid the worst of the problems that might result from leaving untrained men in command of armies. The reason I point out those two partnerships or pairings is because that he had a similar idea for Franz Sigel, and I'll talk more about that idea later. But it was no accident that for each of these men, Grant looked for a trusted West Pointer to put as second in command. So let's talk a little bit about Franz Sigel. This is Franz Sigel, actually at the Battle of Prairie Grove, or I'm sorry, at Pea Ridge in Missouri, or in Arkansas. It's not Sigel at Newmarket. However, the picture is so perfect for what happens for one of Sigel's moments that we decided to employ it for the book cover, and I use it here to kind of talk about Sigel in the Shenandoah. It's a nice piece of artwork, and I like to share it where possible. Franz Sigel is a German. He was born in Baden. He was professionally trained in one of the German military or Kriegs academies. He spent 5 years in military school. Arguably, he had a better military education than most West Pointers. He had 5 years of instruction instead of 4, and he had a lot more instruction, not just in engineering, but in the theory of warfare. If you know a little bit about some of the debates, did Karl von Clausewitz have an impact on the American Civil War? Did the Baron Jomini have an impact on the Civil War? Well, perhaps not in American military academies or military schools, because their works weren't really taught. Jomini is taught a little bit at West Point. Karl von Clausewitz has not been heard of. Not true for the Germans. For the German emigres, some of them studied directly under Karl von Clausewitz in Berlin. Franz Sigel, as a Badener, sort of in Western Germany, didn't study under Clausewitz directly, but the curriculum was heavily influenced by Clausewitz, and he learned a great deal of the theory and practice of war. So he's very well-educated German. He graduates and serves as a young officer in Baden's army. And then the 1848 revolution breaks out, and Franz Sigel is a revolutionary at heart. And so he joins the revolutionaries. Now, the 48 revolution is crushed within a year. By 1849, Sigel has left Germany and he's emigrated to America. He's settled in St. Louis. What's interesting about 1848 is that Sigel comes out of the German Revolution with a very strong military reputation. He was elevated very quickly to command of Baden's Revolutionary Army, and he led raw citizen soldiers in military. He had to form them into military units and then lead them in combat. So not only was he professionally trained, but he had a great deal of arguably practical experience that directly related to the beginning of the American Civil War, when we went from 20,000 or 30,000 professional soldiers to armies of hundreds of thousands of men almost overnight. Sigel is ideally, at least on paper, suited to this kind of work. Grant is going to look for another professional officer. The Department of West Virginia was a vacant command in the beginning of 1864. It was a smaller field command. Its most important mission was protecting the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad across Maryland and northern West Virginia. It was a full department, so it rated a major generalship, and there were several major generals currently without assignments. A number of officers were jockeying for a field command at this time, and Franz Sigel was one of them. He had resigned in the summer, just before Gettysburg, well, some months before Gettysburg, because his command was the 11th Corps, the heavily German 11th Corps. And after the reorganizations, after Joseph Hooker took command of the army after Fredericksburg, Sigel suddenly found himself in command of what he regarded as the smallest corps in the Army of the Potomac. He was a senior major general. He believed that the number of troops he should command should be commensurate with his rank among the other major generals. Hooker said no, and so Sigel resigned. So he was currently without a command, but he's extremely popular as a German American. Lincoln needs the German vote in the 1864 elections. The Army also needs a lot of Germans to try and re-enlist. 1864 is the year that those 3-year enlistments run out, and there's very famously a huge federal effort to retain troops. If 3/4 of the men in a regiment voted to re-enlist or re-enlisted, then that regiment got to call themselves veteran volunteers and keep its organization intact. The government was eager to accentuate this policy, and Sigel would help with the German contingents. It was very important. And so Sigel ended up in command of the Department of West Virginia. He had an overall strength in his department of about 25,000 men, but they were scattered across a large swath of territory, and of course, many of them are left or stationed to guard the Baltimore and Ohio. Edward Otho Cresap Ord. That's a mouthful. I always like that name. I'm not that high on Ord himself, but he has a great name. EOC Ord is a West Pointer. He served in the East early in the war, and then he went west He served under Grant in 1862 and as part of the Vicksburg campaign. He was a particular friend of William Sherman. Through Sherman, he became an officer Grant favored. And so when Ord was restless in Mississippi after Vicksburg, when Grant went east, Ord pulled every string he could to come east with him. And in February of 1864, Ord is sort of politicking Grant to get a new command. Well, Grant is promoted to lieutenant general. Ord sees an opportunity. Ord even thinks he might end up in command of the Department of West Virginia. Instead, it goes to Sigel. But as I said earlier, Grant has this concept that he wants to corset what he regards as unreliable political generals with professionals, and Ord fits the bill. So he's going to assign Ord to Franz Sigel. Now, originally, Grant's plan in 1864, or the overall plan for the Valley, just called for Sigel advancing up the Valley, south from Winchester to Stanton, while George Crook came over the mountains from West Virginia, captured Dublin, Virginia, burned the Virginia and Tennessee Railroad bridge at the New River just outside of Dublin, captured the salt works at Saltville, and then turned north and marched down the valley via Roanoke and Lexington to Stanton as well. The two columns, each of about 10,000 men, would converge on Stanton. Crook wouldn't have to worry about a supply line because when he got to Stanton, Sigel would have the supplies necessary to resupply him. And then they could turn east and operate against Charlottesville and Gordonsville. This is actually something that Robert E. Lee was very worried about. When Grant appointed Ord, he brought Ord in. Ord first met Franz Sigel on April 6th, 1864. Grant changed the plan right at the last minute. Sigel was to basically turn over most of his troops to Ord and let them operate out of Beverly, West Virginia, and march on Stanton from the west. So now it was going to be a three-pronged operation. No more troops were assigned, which meant that most of Ord's strength would have to come from Franz Sigel. Sigel would now be reduced to a very small force, primarily, as Grant told him, your primary mission would simply to escort the supply trains to resupply Crook and Ord. Sigel wasn't happy about this. He was, in fact, very upset. He didn't like Ord when they met. Ord didn't like him. Ord had very much a strong nativist anti-immigrant prejudice, and Franz Sigel was a German. And so they struck sparks right from the beginning. But nevertheless, Sigel immediately started to move troops to reinforce Ord and build up this column in Beverly, West Virginia. There's no railroads really that would serve the purpose to get those troops there. So they marched through April, through a very rainy and even occasionally snowy April to get to Beverly. And when Ord got cast his eyes on them for the first time, he was totally dismayed at the quality of the troops that he'd been given. And I mentioned that he first met Franz Sigel on April 6th. On April 17th, Ord resigned. He simply didn't want the responsibility. He feared that the mission would go badly and he'd get blamed for it. And the quality of the troops that he was assigned was indeed uneven. Many of the troops had been captured in 1863 at Winchester with Milroy just before Gettysburg. Many of them had been exchanged, but their officers were often still in prison. Others had spent the past year and a half guarding railroads, and so had had little time to drill. And drilling, 1860 American Civil War drilling is not just a parade ground thing. It's very important. It's how you control troops on the battlefield. A regiment that can't go from column into line and back into column and change facing, that can't change direction under fire, will simply fall apart. So drill is crucial, and these troops were woefully inadequate in drill. And instead of attempting to take responsibility, instill discipline, and start training these men, Ord simply bailed on the mission. He told his wife he wanted no part of this. He wanted no responsibility for it. And so after 11 days in command, Sigel had to reorganize the entire program again. The Beverly mission was scrapped. Sigel marched many of those troops back up to Martinsburg. But Ord's overall impact on the campaign, even though he never actually took the field, was immense and extremely negative. It was hugely disruptive. About the only positive thing that Sigel saw was that Ord was at least gone. Let's talk a little bit about the two missions and about George Crook and William Woods Averill. Crook was the southern pincer and the primary pincer. His was the most important objective. Cutting the Virginia and Tennessee rail line at Dublin, burning that bridge, was regarded by Grant as the primary objective. And then almost as important was moving up to secure Stanton. Stanton was, by 1864, a Confederate supply hub. Most of the grain that were and livestock that was harvested in the Shenandoah Valley passed through Stanton in 1863 and early 64. It was connected to the rest of Virginia via railroad, and so Lee could draw on it. And Sigel's mission, with relationship to Crook and Averill, was essentially as the decoy. Sigel's job would be to hold Confederate attention at the lower end of the valley, the northern end, while Crook and Averill moved down the valley from the south to basically strike the Confederate rear. And they were the ones everyone expected to take stand. It started well, Crook's expedition. He moved over the mountains in West Virginia, and in early May, they fought the Battle at Cloyd's Mountain, which was a Union victory. The Confederate commander, John C. Breckinridge, had already departed the southern end of the valley, moving to concentrate troops against Franz Sigel. Remember, I told you that Lee regarded the threat from Sigel and the threat from Stanton as the more important. And so they kind of misread the tea leaves and didn't really grasp Crook's expedition until it was too late. Crook actually reached the New River Bridge at Dublin, and they were able to burn the wooden superstructure, but they had no way to damage the stone piers. They tried firing artillery. They tried what they could to knock them over, but they couldn't. And so, as a result, their damage to the Virginia and Tennessee rail line was relatively minimal. Within 10 days after the Confederates recaptured it, they had reopened the rail line. Crook's expedition after Dublin, however, did not proceed as planned. At Dublin, at the telegraph depot at Dublin, Crook had come across Confederate telegrams. This was May 8 and 9. And those telegrams indicated that Lee and Grant had just fought a major battle, Battle of the Wilderness. But they also strongly suggested that Robert E. Lee had won the Battle at the Wilderness. Grant's army was in retreat back across the Rapidan and Rappahannock, and so Lee was now free to turn against George Crook. Why Lee would rush thousands of troops down the valley all the way to face Crook when there were so many other threats developing is hard to fathom, but Crook was unable to move beyond that, and so he, instead of moving towards Stanton, he turned back into West Virginia and worked his way back to Meadow Bluff, where off the Gauley River he could be resupplied via steamboat. What he did was take himself out of the campaign, and he had no way of telling Franz Sigel that he had done so. And so Sigel will be operating through the first 2 weeks of May under the concept, the original concept of the operation, that he was to be drawing the Confederates north while George Crook operated against their rear. And without that piece of information, Sigel was basically exposed to the main Confederate force on his own. The two Confederates that have the most significant roles here are John C. Breckinridge, former vice president in 1856 or 1857 to 1860, now a major general in the Confederate Army, man who had served in the Army of Tennessee as a brigade, division, and corps commander. Didn't get along with Braxton Bragg. I know that's quite a shock. And a brigadier named John D. Imboden, who was a lawyer out of Stanton. Raised a regiment, raised a battery at first and fought at First Bull Run, raised a regiment, and then later a brigade, and was given command of that brigade. It was designated the Northwestern Brigade. It was a mixed force of cavalry and mounted infantry. And Imboden's job was to defend the lower valley. And so he originally occupied Winchester. When in early May, Franz Sigel's army marched out of Martinsburg and occupied Winchester, Imboden retreated and headed south back up the valley, first to Woodstock, to Mount Jackson, and to Newmarket. Sigel's mission, as I've stated, was to draw the Confederates north. Sigel had about 10,000 men at Winchester. He had a division of infantry, a division of cavalry, and 3 artillery batteries. He was also operating in one of the most dangerous partisan areas in the entire South. This is part of Mosby's Confederacy. John Singleton Mosby's battalion, the 43rd Virginia Cavalry or Partisan Ranger Battalion, is operating here. They've been operating for a couple of years, and the Federals are subject to constant raids against their supply lines and detachments. So much so that wagons have to go out heavily escorted. They have to be formed into trains and then accompanied by a battalion of cavalry or a regiment of infantry. Much of Sigel's manpower is going to be eaten up trying to protect that supply line. And it's not just the supply line for his own force, it's also, as you will recall, the supply line for George Crook's force. He has to bring enough strength together or enough supplies together to supply the combined army when they get to Stanton. And so the supply column or the supply aspect of Sigel's mission is very important. And it gets worse with every step south he takes. The further up the valley he goes, the worse, the more men he has to detach to garrison supply points. And so his army is going to get smaller and smaller. He loses about 1,000 effectives to garrison duties for every 20 miles that he marches south down or up the valley. So with only 10,000 men, you can see that if you go 40 miles, now you're at 8,000. Your numbers are dwindling pretty quickly. Stanton is 50 miles away from Winchester, or I'm sorry, 60 miles or so away from Winchester. So if Sigel is going to provide any strength at all to Stanton, he's going to need George Crook's troops to reinforce him there. Breckinridge and Imboden understand this. And when Sigel first starts to move, when he moves into Winchester, Robert E. Lee sends Breckinridge telegrams ordering Breckinridge to concentrate all available force against Franz Sigel. Breckinridge is in the process of making those movements when Sigel or when George Crook comes out of the mountains of West Virginia and defeats the people Breckinridge has left behind at Cloyd's Mountain. So when Crook turns away and moves back into West Virginia, it's really a gift to the Confederates, though Breckinridge won't know that Crook has turned away, just like Sigel, who's going to be in the dark about that movement until after the Battle of Newmarket. Both men, both commanders, Franz Sigel and John Breckinridge, are operating under the theory that Crook is coming from the south towards Stanton, and that Sigel needs to hold Breckinridge as far north as possible. And for Breckinridge's part, he needs to defeat Sigel as quickly as possible so he can turn around and head back south and then defeat George Crook. So Sigel doesn't, once he occupies Winchester, he takes about a week to drill the men that haven't been drilled. He stages mock combat exercises. This is something actually that's significant to German military training at the time. They pose field problems. August Willich and some other Germans have done the same thing, and Americans find it a real novelty. Some take to it, some don't. For instance, they don't just go out and drill a regiment and run it through its maneuvers. They'll set up Sigel will say, okay, we're going to attack that tree line. There's a Confederate brigade there, and the object is to maneuver the whole force as if it's conducting an actual military assault. It's kind of a concept way ahead of its time, especially for the United States Army in the 1860s. Most of the troops under Sigel don't really get the concept, and actually a number of officers make fun of him for it, which is really short-sighted because many of these same officers are going to have some severe problems when they actually enter combat on May 15th. So Breckinridge moves north. He joins with John D. Imboden, and he's bringing troops up. This is when he calls out the VMI cadets. Sigel, so far, has done what he's supposed to do. He's taken Winchester, established a base of supplies, and then on the 11th of May, he starts very cautiously to move further up the valley. Now, at Winchester, Sigel captured some Confederate documents that pretty much laid out the Confederate disposal of forces. He knew that Breckinridge was off to the south. He knew that Imboden had only about 2,500 men in the Northwestern Brigade, and that he had a significant numeric advantage, say May 10th and 11th. Other historians have faulted him for not seizing the initiative and charging against Imboden as quickly as possible. But I think that criticism is misplaced for two reasons. One, remember his mission. He's not to push the Confederates south, but to draw them as far north as possible, draw them away from Stanton, not push them to Stanton. And secondly, Imboden's cavalry and mounted infantry have no reason to stand and fight. If Sigel catches up to them at Woodstock, they'll simply retreat. If he catches up to them at Mount Jackson or Newmarket, they'll simply retreat. There's no payoff for the Confederates for standing and fighting against such significant odds. Imboden is fulfilling his mission too, which is to screen the Federal advance and not get caught up in a general engagement. So Sigel's pause actually works to the Federal favor. It draws the Confederates further north. Um, it opens the way to Stanton for George Crook. Alas for Sigel and for the Union war effort, George Crook has taken himself out of the game by this point. And then Sigel advances very cautiously. May 12 and 13, he moves his main body to Woodstock. He sends a cavalry expedition to Front Royal and then through the Luray Valley. The valley here is separated into two halves by Massanutten Mountain, and Luray Valley is the narrower valley on the eastern side. And the reason it's important is that if you don't advance simultaneously down both sides of the mountain, as they learned in 1862, Stonewall Jackson can use the other side of the mountain, whichever valley isn't held, to simply come up in your rear and attack you from the rear. So Sigel is going to send a cavalry expedition under Colonel Boyd through the Luray Valley to clear it. And Boyd's column is to meet up with Colonel Augustus Moore's advance brigade of Sigel's army at Newmarket about May 13th or 14th. Boyd's expedition kind of demonstrates why Sigel was having so many problems, because Boyd was rash, imprudent. He led his 500 cavalrymen into what amounts to an ambush at Newmarket by Imboden's 2,500 men. Boyd's column is crushed on May 13th, so badly disrupted that it's effectively eliminated. And really, the Federals are being outfought here. Even though they have a somewhat larger numerical advantage, everything is conspiring to reduce that advantage, so that Sigel is his ever diminishing force is heading up the valley. He sends Colonel Moore up to Newmarket on May 14, and that's when they encounter Imboden again, just south of Newmarket on a hill called Shirley Hill. And what they don't know is that Breckinridge is now only a few hours march away, with about 3,500 men, 3,000 or so troops, plus 500 local militia, and of course the VMI cadets. So Colonel Moore has only about 2,000 men, 1,200 infantry, and maybe 800 cavalry with him at Newmarket on the evening of May 14. They halt. Moore kind of does a surprising thing. He lets his infantry actually go into camp. They start pitching tents right in front of the Confederates. And once again, we're seeing that inexperience and the lack of solid federal leadership at the small unit level that makes the Confederates superior to the Federals here. Sigel doesn't want to fight at Newmarket. Moore is only sent to investigate and kind of provoke a Confederate response. When Breckinridge comes up early on the morning of May 15, however, Moore doesn't retreat. Instead, he forms a battle line and prepares to accept battle. And here Breckinridge does kind of a strange thing. Remember, I said that Breckinridge is under a great deal of pressure to defeat the Federal quickly. He has to take out the Federal troops under Sigel so he can then turn south and go after George Crook. So the time pressure is all really on John C. Breckinridge at the Battle of Newmarket. Sigel doesn't have to fight here, but Moore decides to hold his ground and so kind of forces the fight. And Breckinridge comes up first thing in the morning, sees the opportunity, realizes that there aren't that many Federals in front of him, 4 regiments of infantry and some cavalry. But instead of attacking, he halts on Shirley's Hill, forms his troops up, and tries to get Colonel Moore to attack him. Remember, Breckinridge has the time pressure. So the halt that burns up most of the morning is really unusual. He also knows that that more Federals are on the way because scouts have told him so. So the longer he waits, the more Federals he's going to have to fight. Nevertheless, about 11:15, Breckinridge comes down off Shirley Hill. The Federals clearly aren't attacking. So Breckinridge advances. The Confederates fall back to a secondary position. I'm sorry, the Federals fall back to a secondary position at the Rice House. And then about 12:30 or 1 o'clock, by which time Franz Sigel has arrived on the field. And Sigel, when he arrives, is upset. Not only does Moore have standing orders to withdraw in the face of a Confederate attack, but at 8 o'clock that morning, Sigel sent his chief of staff, a Hungarian emigre called Julius Stahl, to forward to join Moore with orders to retreat, express orders to retreat to a place called Rude's Hill, about 4 or 5 miles north, which was a very strong defensive position. So Moore and now Stahl have ignored all these orders to retreat, and so Sigel reaches the battlefield, and suddenly he finds that Moore's front line is under attack by what they estimate is 7,000 Confederates. Really, it's closer to 5,000. But in Moore's 3 front regiments, the 18th Connecticut, the 123rd Ohio, and the 1st West Virginia, they really only have 1,200 men. And so if the first phase of the battle is that morning pause, the middle phase of the battle is a Confederate success where they attack the Union line at the Rice House and break it and drive it in almost complete route north. And in the meantime, Franz Sigel has formed a final line on Bushong Hill that overlooks the Bushong House and is today the core of the actual Newmarket battlefield, the preserved land of the Newmarket battlefield. So Sigel has formed a defensive line with the surviving infantry. He has most of his cavalry massed along the Valley Turnpike, about 1,800 Federal cavalry, and he actually orders them to attack. Their charge is a failure, and in the wake of that cavalry defeat, John C. Breckinridge reorganizes his battle line and sends the whole force forward against that final position on Bushong Hill. The fighting grows intense. At one point, some of the Confederates, the 26th Virginia Battalion and some of the other units actually break and force a gap in the Confederate battle line at about the Bushong House. And that's when the famous order is given. Breckinridge says, put the boys in. The VMI Cadet Battalion goes into the front line. And while, and things are about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, this is now ongoing in the midst of a violent thunderstorm, by the way. But about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the Confederate attacks have failed against the final position, and Sigel decides that now is the time for his line to counterattack in turn. And this is really a mistake. And the primary reason is that the uncertain and unsteady nature of those Federal regiments, some of them have experienced nothing but garrison duties. The 3 main regiments, the 34th Massachusetts, the 1st West Virginia, and the 54th Pennsylvania, go forward from Bushong Hill in a counterattack, but they do it very haphazardly, one regiment at a time. The 34th Massachusetts moves very slowly. The 54th Pennsylvania moves unsupported along the Valley Pike. And the Confederate battle line, which outnumbers them, just chews them up in this counterattack. And as they are first checked and then start to fall back to the Union artillery line on the top of Bushong Hill, then the Confederates charge in turn, and that pressure is too much. The Union line essentially shatters at that point. And Franz Sigel has lost the Battle of Newmarket. Almost certainly that Union counterattack was a tremendous overreach. It was arguably the textbook solution to a circumstance like that. The Confederates, the attackers, have paused. They seem to be wavering. If those were veteran regiments and they had delivered a coordinated counterattack, it might be Breckinridge's troops that are shattered and in retreat. But that turns out not to be the case. But so Breckinridge is defeated. He falls back to first to Mount Jackson and then Woodstock. Grant is disappointed but not surprised. Halleck warns him that Halleck, who knew him in Missouri, says he does nothing but run. I knew he would do nothing but run. And within a few days, Sigel is relieved of command. A new man is brought in, David Hunter, who will take command. Breckinridge, who has successfully defended the valley, he finds out on the afternoon of May 15th, at the as the Battle of Newmarket is concluding, he finds out that George Crook has moved back into West Virginia, so the entire valley is safe again. Within a week, Robert E. Lee will summon Breckinridge's infantry, now formed into a division, and they'll join the Army of Northern Virginia. So when David Hunter comes back in late May, early June, John Imboden has only a handful of troops under his Northwestern Brigade, and Stanton will eventually be captured by David Hunter's men in mid-June after the Battle of Piedmont. So Newmarket is a Confederate success, but a fairly fleeting one. But as its impact on the war is relatively small. But what I find interesting about it from a command or a staff-wide perspective is, of all of these commanders that we've talked about, Ord, George Crook, we haven't talked much about Averill, but he didn't perform well here either. Franz Sigel, the man who came the closest to filling Grant's objectives, who tried his best to do exactly what Grant wanted him to do, is Franz Sigel. He loitered in the lower valley. He drew the Confederates north. He opened the door for George Crook to move up. Other circumstances beyond his control meant that Crook didn't advance. And so when, even at the tactical level, while Sigel is certainly no military genius, there wouldn't have been a battle in Newmarket had either Moore or Stahl obeyed their orders and disengaged and fallen back. When Sigel did finally give battle, he commanded in a disjointed fashion. He didn't try or he didn't effectively coordinate the two Union battle lines, Moore's line and his final line on Bushong Hill. So he certainly earns a share of criticism. But he's not just a cardboard cutout of failure that is so often propped up in Civil War books and roundtable discussions. There are reasons for his actions, and militarily justifiable reasons for his actions. For most of the campaign, he did his utmost to fulfill Grant's orders, and he came very close to doing so. And let's see, it's 8:30. We've covered just about an hour's worth of ground, so thank you.
Thank you, Dave. At this time, excuse me, hopefully you will have tons of questions. So let's go.
All right.
Any inquiring minds here?
I see a couple on the chat here.
Okay, good. Go for it.
Dave, you commented on a post I wrote on Facebook. I was doing some research on the cavalry during the opening of the Atlanta campaign. You mentioned that no such book existed. Could this be your next project? Well, it's part of my next project, though. I don't want to focus exclusively on the cavalry, though I think you probably could. There is an excellent book called Sherman's Horsemen, which focuses on the cavalry in the Atlanta campaign, but unfortunately it doesn't begin until mid-campaign. That book begins in July of 1864. The months of May and June are overlooked. But I certainly will discuss cavalry operations, because when you write about the operational level of war in the Civil War, cavalry is front and center of that. It's the reconnaissance, the eyes and ears. It's critical. So let's see. And here's another question. I heard in the news the Stonewall Jackson statue was removed from VMI. Can you explain how that came about, and how do you feel about it? Well, it came about because of basically some complaints about racial bias from Black and other minority cadets within the Corps of Cadets. Now, some of those got reported first in the Roanoke Times and then the Washington Post. I have no inside knowledge about whether those accounts of harassment are accurate, but I don't have any reason to believe that they're inaccurate either. And of course, in the wake of Charlottesville, there's a lot of pressure on a lot of Southern institutions over statues and things like that. I'm of mixed minds about Stonewall Jackson. I would like to see the statue remain. I'm not hysterically upset about it. After all, it is only a statue. Also, I am more irritated that they want to move the statue to the Newmarket battlefield. Well, Stonewall Jackson was dead a year by the time Newmarket was fought. While, yes, it's part of the Valley campaign, in 1862, Stonewall Jackson passed through Newmarket in the Valley. The Newmarket battlefield really focuses primarily on the Battle of Newmarket. So unless they're going to expand the museum's mission and talk about some other 1862 campaign stuff, Stonewall Jackson really just doesn't belong there. Certainly among my classmates and other classes, there's been a lot of back and forth about removing Jackson. I don't think moving a statue is going to solve any tremendous problems. But by the same token, I also don't think it's the end of civilization as we know it, as at least a couple of my classmates seem to feel. So we'll see. What did Mosby's forces do during this campaign? Did they try and cut Sigel's supply line? Yes, they tried to cut Sigel's supply line constantly. They intercepted supply convoys. They captured dozens of men. They burned wagons. They operated two of Mosby's 4 companies of partisans operated in the Shenandoah Valley around Winchester. Berryville, which is just outside of Winchester, was a hotbed of problems. Much of Sigel's cavalry was spent chasing the partisans, and in fact, a lot of his cavalry simply got worn out before the campaign even really got started. So they were an enormous thorn in Sigel's side. And then the other 2 companies of Mosby's men operated on the other side of the Bull Run Mountains around Loudon and kind of that upper, along the Potomac River area. So, but for Sigel, it was an enormous problem, much bigger problem than, say, George Crook experienced in Southwest Virginia. And I have another question here. Did Crook move back into Virginia from West Virginia to support Hunter? Yes, he did, though he didn't march overland. He took steamboats back to Charleston, West Virginia, and then they got on the Baltimore and Ohio, and were railroaded to Martinsburg, and actually came down from the north the same way that Sigel did. And so when Hunter moved on Stanton in June, he had a force of about 15 or 16,000 men, close to twice the force that Sigel had. And by then he was facing a much smaller Confederate force. He had nearly a 3-to-1 advantage at the Battle of Piedmont, which was fought, I think, in June 6th, just north of Stanton. So, and then Crook and Hunter will move east. They'll be reinforced and move roughly 20,000 men all the way to Lynchburg, where the Battle of Lynchburg forces Robert E. Lee to reinforce them with Jubal Early and the Confederate Second Corps. By this time, the Army of Northern Virginia is tied down in Petersburg, in the Siege of Petersburg. So that leads us directly to the whole 1864 early Sheridan Valley campaign. So it's back and forth. But yes, most of Hunter's troops end up back in the valley for the rest of 1864. Anything else?
Quick question, Dave. Did Sigel ever have any commands after Newmarket?
Well, he was sort of kicked upstairs. He wasn't relieved of command. And as a matter of fact, Sigel does a very good job of defending the heights above Harper's Ferry, Maryland Heights, when Jubal Early is trying to cross the Potomac and invade Washington, or attack Washington in July. And then, but Sigel is a departmental commander. He's basically riding a desk in Martinsburg after Newmarket for June and July. And then he goes back to, or he's finally relieved of command, I believe, after the election, when it's safe, when the votes are in and it's safe to mess with the German vote.
Got it. Thank you.
A couple more questions. Do you believe that Franz Sigel's command was inadequate for the task assigned by Grant? Why were not more experienced regiments used for this plan? I totally agree with that. I do believe that Franz Sigel needed more. Well, let's put it this way. Grant moved south with more than 100,000 men, 110,000 men. He had so many troops in the wilderness that, as a matter of fact, he had trouble finding them places in the battle line. Suppose a couple of divisions had been taken from the Army of the Potomac and assigned to the valley. Robert E. Lee was definitely afraid that they would operate against his rear. They would move down the valley, cross out of the valley at Stanton, and operate in his rear against Charlottesville and Gordonsville. And had Sigel been reinforced to 25 or 30,000 men, that could easily have happened. But a more experienced commander, veteran troops, all would have made a huge difference, I think. Ultimately, that's what Grant did. If we fast forward to October, September and October, what do we got? We have the Army of the Potomac. We have the cavalry in the 6th Corps. We have Sheridan himself coming to command. I mean, Grant finally devoted the resources to it, but not until the fall. Another question: why does Hunter leave the valley and head to West Virginia after being so successful at Lynchburg? Another interesting question. Scott Patchen, who is a solid Civil War historian and has written a great deal about the 1864 Valley campaigns, has told me that he believes that Hunter did so at the behest of George Crook. Crook basically well, Scott believes that Crook lost his nerve again and fell back into West Virginia because Robert E. Lee was now shipping troops from the Army of Northern Virginia. Crook and Hunter were afraid that they would be overwhelmed. They had a very tenuous supply line back through Stanton and down the valley, and so they retreated into the valley. And then instead of turning north, they again went west into West Virginia, where they took themselves out of the war. It would be once again, it would be a couple of weeks before they could reorganize and get back into the fight. It was a very strange movement, and but Scott Patchen is pretty strong, is relatively firm on the opinion that that was actually Crook's influence, not Hunter. And then, did Sigel write any post-war commentaries about this campaign? Yes, he did. There's a lengthy article in Battles and Leaders where he discusses his decisions. He also has, in the Sigel papers in the Western Reserve Historical Society, there's something that, for want of a better name, I term the Sigel Newmarket Campaign Journal, which is essentially a daily military operational diary of events and things. It's clearly been at least lightly edited in the post-war era, but for the most part, it's kind of Sigel's day-to-day thinking about operations. So not only do we have a lengthy post-war commentary about the campaign, but we also have some interesting glimpses into his day-to-day thinking as well. And of course, in his post-war efforts, he tries to fully justify what happened, exonerate himself, all the usual things that old generals do. And but certainly in terms of the historical record, he hasn't had much sympathy in the past 150 years.
Well, I don't know if there are any more questions. You are free to answer some, but I just had just a question. This is a technical thing. When Sigel remained in command at Harper's Ferry, that wasn't a theater, that was a district? He was district commander?
He was retained as the overall commander of the Department of West Virginia.
Oh, okay.
But
Department of West
But
Virginia.
David Hunter was given command of the field army, basically.
I see.
Typically, a Union Army or a Union organization, for instance, when Grant commanded the Army of the Tennessee, he also commanded the Department of the Tennessee. And so when George Thomas or William Rosecrans commanded the Army of the Cumberland, they also commanded the Department of the Cumberland. So usually those two jobs were held by the same guy. The Army and the Department were synonymous. After Newmarket, the federal government separated that and said, General Sigel, you go sit over there at the desk and let General Hunter take field command.
So in the end then, Dave, although Sigel obviously wasn't one of the best Union generals, he was not well served then. That's basically your opinion? Perhaps he could have done better with more experienced troops and subordinates who obeyed his commands?
Yes, he was very poorly served by almost everybody who served in the campaign, and I begin with EOC Ord. You know, if your army is in bad shape and needs drill and needs discipline and training, who better than an experienced West Point general to instill that discipline and training? Instead, Ord just bailed on the whole thing. It was 11 days between the time he met Sigel and they discussed the mission and he offered his resignation. You can't do anything in 11 days. It was, I find it a very cowardly act. Certainly an act of moral cowardice to wash your hands and run away rather than what every officer is expected to do. They're given a difficult mission. They salute, say yes, sir, and do their best to execute that command.
But then Ord became one of Grant's chief lieutenants later during the
Yes.
overland campaign or at Petersburg.
The weird thing about Grant is that if you're in Grant's circle, you're in the circle, and if you're out of the circle, you're not going to get into the circle very easily. And Grant, it's a principle that will extend all the way through Grant's presidency. Grant believes in taking care of his friends. I mean, politically, it's called the spoils system, and militarily, Grant took care of his friends, and Ord was a friend by then. So it's kind of a Grant is by no means the perfect commander. He's arguably the best commander of the Civil War, and he's a great general, but he has plenty of blind spots.
Very well. I don't know if we have more questions, but if not, I want to thank Dave for this excellent talk. You are a font of knowledge on all matters pertaining not only to the Western Theater, but it would seem now that you've got something going on here with the at least the early part of the Shenandoah campaign, which turned into a very complicated set of operations as the year went by. There's no doubt about that. But presuming there are no more questions, I'd like to remind everyone of next month's meeting. January 8th. We'll have Jennifer Murray here. Jennifer studied under Kenneth Noe at Auburn University. I discovered that when I was talking to her, asking her, why is you live in Oklahoma, and why do you have why does it say Auburn, Alabama on your phone? So she told me about that. So that's going to be very interesting. She will be discussing the role of General Meade in the war. I think we all know there's been a lot of attention paid to Meade as of late with Hunt's books and other writings, Leah's Trapped, etc. So we'll look forward to that discussion. And again, as always, I'd like to thank Mark Kunis for hosting us here. He is a real stalwart. Without him, I don't know what I'd do. So with that, there be no more questions. I will say good evening to you all. It's always good to see your bright and sunny faces. Goodness knows, someday we will see each other in person. I hope so. But we'll have to abide by events. So good night to y'all.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you for Christmas and
thank you again,
Dave.
Dave. Thank you.
Hi, Marshall.
Oh, Marshall.
Thanks, Dave.
Thanks for checking in. It's good to see you. How you feeling? Oh, he's muted.
You got to unmute, Marshall.
Unmute, Marshall. We want to hear your voice. Can you unmute yourself? I don't know. Is he frozen there? Can't tell.
He's muted.
I can wait. Go ahead, Fred. Remind him.
I'm trying, Marshall. You got to unmute. Can you unmute? Go to the top corner.
There should be something there on your screen, Marshall. It's the mute, the microphone.
Right, there's a microphone. You got to unmute.
Well, maybe he just doesn't want to talk to us.
I do one of these a month, which is just far enough apart that I forget everything I learned from the last session by the time I'm ready for the next one.
Well, I'm a technological illiterate. Without Mark, none of this would happen. I just sit here and talk. It's easy for me to do.
Yeah.
But anyway, if Marshall isn't going to unmute, Marshall, we all wish you the best. Good to see you, and look forward to seeing you in January 8th, okay? I guess that's an okay.
All right.
Hey guys, January.
Take care, everybody. Good night.
Good night.
Thanks again, Dave.
Thank you.